The introduction. So in the 1820s, the cultural life of most slaves reflected both on the values of the Western American cultures and also the American culture in the South white population. And this mixture of African and European cultural values discouraged some to assimilate their own culture and figuring in the American culture themselves. So first I'll be talking about the evangelical Black Protestantism. So at first, the emergence of Black Christianity clarified the combinations of African and European cultures, which the Second Great Awakening swept over the South, and the evangelical Baptist and Methodist preachers converted thousands of white families and hundreds of enslaved Blacks until the Africans identified themselves as it, but most of them identified by their ritual scars or maintained their religious practices. The second was how they were converted. Africans carried the traditional religious practices in the United States. Some practiced Islam, but the majority relied on African gods and spirits. In the late 1842, a Presbyterian minister, Charles Jones, noted that Blacks of his family plantation in Georgia believed that in second sight in apparitions or charms or witchcraft. And because of this, it kind of brought more Protestant preachers and planters to set out to convert slaves, and which caused a chain of reactions towards the conversion of many Africans. The second thing I'll be talking about is the foraging of families and communities. Black Protestantism was one facet of increasingly similarity of African community culture in rural areas in the South during the 1800s. The domestic slave trade mingled Blacks from many states and erased regional differences and promoted the emergence of core cultures. For example, the Goa dialect, which incorporated African dialect and also English dialect. And African Americans also continued to respect African incest taboos, such as shunning marriage between cousins, and the creation of socialities was part of the community's building process. The next I'll be talking about is negotiating rights. Legally speaking, owners had unlimited power over the slaves, but these powers were based on violence. Passive resistance by these African American slaves try to limit owners' powers by either saying that they were sick or by losing their tools or plows. Over decades, hundreds of individual slaves responded by attacking their masters and overseers, and over time, African Americans pressed their owners for a greater share of product and labor. And by the 1850s, thousands of African Americans were acquiring small rewards, even by sharing the crops that they stole from the owner by these underground economies and accumulating sizable property. And the next thing and final thing I'll be talking about is the free Black population. And some African Americans slavery through either the grant from their owner or by just leaving. And through the North, it was either through gradual emancipation of laws by 1840, which pretty much ended bound laborers. Half of the Blacks in the United States lived in free states of the North, but few enjoyed the freedom because whites regarded African Americans as social inferiors and combined them with low-paying jobs that most people would do. Privileged minorities among African Americans in the South kind of divided loyalties between each other in order to advance their welfare and their families, and also distance themselves from the plantation itself. And this pretty much shows that kind of like up north there was many free Blacks rather than in the South. Then, pretty much in conclusion, churches, families, and environments around African Americans became the core institutions of African American societies, providing them strength and comfort and the hardships of slavery that they've been through, which was seen by foraging societies and white freedom. And that's it.
Oh, I did the American system? Yeah. Jefferson and Madison doomed the states by reducing any and all tax rates. The U.S. Army and Navy shrank, along with responsibilities moved only to the states. The War of 1812 left the U.S. deep in debt, with financial reality becoming a real threat. Luckily for Clay, nationalism surged, and the reshaping of the economic system was urged. So put forth by Senator Henry Clay, the National Economic Plan was on the way. To pass taxes and establish central banks, the creation of roads and canals thrusted Clay into the ranks. Tariff of 1816 placed high taxes on English cotton to prevent England's textile industry from becoming rotten. Becoming so popular, tariffs spread to iron and wool, but eventually became more of a political tool. The North and West pushed the South into the night. The tariff of 1828 accumulated the fight. Raise the taxes to 38, they shouted, imposing more taxes on all that was imported. Disagreements began between Calhoun and Jackson. They went back and forth over the South's opinions. The tariff now nulled and void, the South could breathe again. Nevertheless, resigned Calhoun, realizing he must not remain. Now, following the Revolutionary War, Hamilton's fiscal plan was a score. Bank of the United States was used as a stool, dividing North and South once more, claiming only for a North merchant power game score, weakening local and state banks in the work, and calling for the 1816 rechartered bank to be groundwork. Conflict stormed with Jackson's election. Kill the bank was the Democrats and Jackson's objection. Attempts to revoke the bank were at conflict's core. Ultimately, they became known as the Bank War. Clay got the rechartered passed, Jackson would learn, but he couldn't risk another election year economic downturn. Downgraded to the common man, Jackson still couldn't veto the bill under his force of hand. The bank was killed in 1836 with the charter. This was marked as the free banking era starter. The third component of Clay's American system combined the visions of Jefferson and Hamilton. They said to him, agricultural South and industrialized North, connecting them would not cut the nation short. The Maysville Road was built of the single state road, wasn't thought of twice before it was vetoed. Jackson argued the federal government shall not be responsible for such an establishment. Jackson fought his political enemy, arguing that this matter shall be left for the state of Kentucky. With every road, cities and people were encouraged west. With easier access to supplies and goods, they would begin their quest. The regions continued their efforts even though all conflict, for the Great Lakes provided to be a great accomplishment. Expansion to the west proved to be a huge task. However, for what more could they ask? Although the project began by leaving many skeptical, it left New York City in the financial capital.
Let's get this.
Okay, so in section 1, it refers to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution written by Jefferson. And in the woman's point of view, she's saying that the Constitution should apply to all the people, while in the men's point of view, he's saying that it only applies to men. And men during this time period, they thought that women couldn't be able to comprehend politics, like in voting or in general.
Okay, so the second section refers to the Seneca Falls Convention, which occurred in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. So this convention was led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and it essentially, the meeting set the agenda that catalyzed the women's rights movement, and basically it just called for the equal treatment of women and called for their right to vote.
Third section refers to the Civil War, in which many women actually volunteered as nurses, which showed that women had greater responsibilities and was capable of doing them.
Okay, so this refers to the 14th Amendment and how citizenship was granted to all slaves, which led to the 15th Amendment, which gave black men the right to vote. So the 14th Amendment outlined men and males, which was like what men during this time period referred back to like exclude women from their rights.
The 15th, right? The 14th gave citizenship.
Yeah.
Section 5, the rules the man is referring to comes from the Constitution, and that refers to that that only referred to men when in regards to voting.
Okay, so the next section, this begins to list multiple places in which women were granted suffrage. So the newly added Western states granted women with the right to vote because there were like barely any women in the West. So they wanted to like make it more appealing so more women would come flocking to the West to like try and balance out the population. And Kaiser refers to the Emperor of Germany, which like I don't even know they had one. Okay, so this takes a shot at the men's ideology of being democratic and like how are you going to claim to be a democratic society but not provide the fundamental rights that you think a democratic society would have?
Section 7, Carrie Catt and Alice Paul were women suffragist leaders who campaigned for the addition of the 19th Amendment in the United States Constitution, and this shows the movement is gaining momentum, and the females of society won't stop fighting to be seen as equals in the eyes of the law in society.
So the amendment in question is the 19th Amendment, which would give females the right to vote, and in 1920 this amendment was passed.
Though this does lead into the next unit, it shows that at the end it shows that the guy begins to realize that granting the female's request would potentially give them an advantage to voting.
Yes. Very good.
This is my poem about the market revolution. In the first half of the 19th century, just before the Civil War, occurred a revolution like no revolution before. In this revolution, American economy began to mature. The very ways of life would drastically change from what they were. From farms to factories, America's middle class begins to grow. From walking to trains, in distant places, products will be sold. At first, Americans produced many goods for themselves. Then they started working to produce for everyone else. From Jeffersonian ideals to overseas sales, the ideas of Hamilton would be the ones that prevail. With the increase of better technology, transportation was easier and faster. With railroads and canals, shipping goods was much cheaper. The types of transportation ranged from steamboats and trains. Manufactured products could be shipped from Florida to Maine. With the use of telegraphs, there was increased communication. Companies could talk about when to expect shipments and how much they would cost. They traded information. There were three main factors that contributed to the market revolution. With transportation, communication, and manufacturing, American economy began booming. Although corporations were getting richer, the factory workers felt that something wasn't right. Instead of work times being regulated by the seasons and the sun, work hours were regulated by the clock, not the night. Many people were resentful of the market revolution, saying that Americans were meant to be free. With the market revolution revising the economy, most American people had to go to work in factories. The market revolution was powered by investments. The federal state invented limited liability. With the government protecting corporations, investments were used to overall boost the economy. Some say the market revolution was the beginning of American economy. Some say the market revolution was the beginning of the lack of freedom in American society. Some say the market revolution is why America is the richest country. Some say the market revolution is why we obsess over money. Whether opinion or truth, the market revolution boosted America's economy forward. It changed the economic approach of not just America, but of other countries in the world moreover.
Very good. That was really good.
Thank you.
Yeah, she got
Is that a
all-
question?
That was really good.
And what is Transcendentalism? It's the intellectual movement rooted in religious beliefs, and it emphasized the importance of an ideal world of physical knowledge and harmony beyond the immediate grasp of senses. And it occurred in the early 19th century in New England. And so some important people that we're going to touch on are Ralph Waldo Emerson, Margaret Fuller, Henry David Thoreau, and Walt Whitman.
So how did Transcendentalism begin? The first supporters for Transcendentalism were Unitarian ministers, or people that believed God was a single being and not the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit Trinity. And Unitarians began to build off the new concept of self in society, and they welcomed human passion and philosophical thinkers.
So Ralph Waldo Emerson was a philosopher, poet, and lecturer, and he kind of led the transcendentalist movement of the 19th century. He's most known for his essay Self-Reliance, where he argued that self-sufficiency gives one the freedom to discover their true self and attain independence. And he wrote other influential essays about what he referred to as the infinitude of the private man, or like the radically free person. And there's a picture of him.
So who was Henry David Thoreau? He was a leading transcendentalist, American essay writer, and a poet and philosopher. And his most famous piece of writing was his book Walden, written after the death of his brother, where he reflects upon living in nature rather than living in the artificiality of civilized society. And after the book was published, he began advocating to avoid conformity to social norms and to peacefully resist unjust laws.
And while Henry David Thoreau was doing that, Margaret Fuller was advocating for women's rights, and so she was a women's advocate, writer, and editor during the 19th century, and she's associated with the transcendentalism movement. She's most known for helping Ralph Waldo Emerson found The Dial, which was a magazine, and after this, she edited it full-time, making her the first full-time female book reviewer in journalism.
Alright, and Walt Whitman, he was a famous journalist and poet from the 19th century, and he's known for incorporating transcendentalism and realism into his works. And his most famous poem is Leaves of Grass, where Whitman highlights the beauty of the individual. And in 1882, the district attorney of Boston, he moved to get the Leaves of Grass banned entirely, because not a lot of people were strong believers in transcendentalism.
And finally, the impacts of transcendentalism were that they encouraged the abandonment of tradition and embraced free thought. And these authors encouraged later novelists, including Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville. And the transcendentalism movement was one of self-reliance, individualism, women's rights, abolition, and reform that is still seen in today's society. And then that's all.
That's very aesthetically pleasing. What is this picture?
We did utopias, and a utopia is an ideal community that allows people to live differently and realize their spiritual potential. Communities were mostly in the north, and groups tried to create their own perfect societies, isolated from others, by experimenting with different forms of social organizations. The utopias focused on improving spiritual practice while also transforming moral, social, and often economic relationships among individuals. The first idea of a utopian society was marked in the Republic, a famous work written by the famous philosopher Plato. And Sir Thomas More wrote Utopia in 1516, describing a perfect political and social system on an imaginary island. More than 80 utopian communities were launched in the 1840s alone, but the movement's earliest communities were the Shakers.
Alright, so some background information. Most of these cities were launched in the 1800s. That's the timeline. Why it happened? Because the reformers from the Second Great Awakening, they were looking to get away with the laws and everything because they didn't agree with the political system. So they're like, oh, let's go make our own societies. Which a lot of these societies, they did not work well in the capitalistic America. And those are like some of the societies, but we'll get there.
Okay, so the Shaker communities was founded by an English woman, Anne Lee, who came to America in 1774. And they practiced strict sexual abstinence since they believed the Christian millennium was imminent and therefore saw no reason to perpetuate the human race. Anne Lee died in 1784, but the section continued to prosper on the strength of its fervent and joyful religious life. The Shakers admired simplicity and made an art of designing buildings and furniture of distinctive, harmonious beauty. Their high ideals and lack of controversial practices allowed Shakers to live in harmony with their neighbors. By the 1830s, there were 20 Shaker communities. By the 1840s, the Shakers had a membership of some 6,000. They continued to exist for another 100 years, but they dwindled slowly because new recruits and converts were hard to find.
They were surrounded by Christians at that time, and the Christians' belief was completely different, so that kind of harmed them, that kind of brought them to like the low point. On top of that, their economic decline, and people they were being lazy, they didn't want to do the work. Because in this societies, they're like, okay, everyone does the work, everyone's equal, and everyone shares the wealth. Kind of like communism, but it didn't work out so well because they're surrounded by other people.
So New Harmony and Brook Farms, these were a bit of the smaller utopia societies. New Harmony was founded in 1825 in Indiana by a wealthy Scottish textile manufacturer, Robert Owen. The community perished early from lack of harmony among its participants, and the Amana communities in New York and Iowa were also short-lived, fading away by the end of the 1850s.
Sorry.
Alright, so there were
No, no laughing. I'm sorry. That was on me.
there were bad rumors about them, and they were like, okay, these guys believe in more than just Jesus. So they also died out, and Smith got arrested for that and killed.
Disappointed.
Okay, so this is a map of the utopian societies in the north, right? So you guys can look at that.
That's the picture of the Shaker's Utopia. This picture, it was widely used to convey other people that we are equal, and you see all the women on one side, men on one side, they're doing the same thing.
This is the New Harmony Utopia, the flag that stands there, the place. And then here's a video.
The idea of utopian communities in America originated from Plato's Republic and Sir Thomas More's Utopia, as well as the ideal society of Eden from the Bible. These ideas spread to the New World and the Protestant Reformation with the desire to form a more perfect communal society. St. Benedict of Nursia, who founded the Benedictine order, Christianized the concepts of utopia. Utopian communities came in waves. The first wave was focused on religious movements. However, more popular in Europe, an example of one in the New World was the Ephrata community that sailed to the New World in 1732. But they eventually failed when typhus struck their community. With the New World, they were attempting to construct a new unpolluted society as they believed that the New World was an opportunity for a fresh start. The second wave of utopian communities was focused on reform movements. An example of a second wave utopian community was the Brook Farm, founded by George and Sophia Riley in 1841. They strongly believed in social reform and self-reliance, but sadly, they died out due to an outbreak of smallpox and then a fire.
Another example was the Fruitlands. They were a transcendentalist society that participated in an extreme form of vegetarianism. They believed that vegetables had souls. Another community that you may be familiar with was the Oneida community, which was founded by John Humphrey Noyes in New York. This was a democratic society and believed in complex marriages of multiple partners. This community was known for producing Oneida silverware. The third wave of utopian communities was predominantly made up of industrial struggling workers. They were mostly found in Washington state. Because they were made out of poor, unskilled workers, they protested unfair labor laws and the economy. The fourth and final wave began in the 1970s and 60s. This wave was based around the idea that man should leave the smallest impact on Earth through organic farming. This wave also rejected the traditional nuclear family structure that had been so popular during the time period. To attract followers, groups who supported this wave based themselves near colleges.
Copyright.
Well, we're done.
All right.
The First Great Awakening resulted in great change in religion in America. This led to a movement called the Second Great Awakening. Okay, so the Second Great Awakening occurred between the 1800s and 1840s. It began in the 1800s in New England, New York, Kentucky, and Tennessee. This was a Christian revivalist movement that featured large revival meetings and where passionate preachers expressed their ideas to American public, which sparked social reformation such as the temperance movement, women's suffrage, and anti-slavery abolitionist movement. It was different from the First Great Awakening because the revival meetings drifted away from the traditional evangelism and conversation to gathering people into denominations, away from Calvinist tradition and moved towards the idea of free will. people could choose to be saved and that salvation was open to human beings. Charles Grandison Finney was the father of modern revivalism. He made significant innovations in preaching and religious meetings. He was the author of religious revivals. Finney was socially progressive and supported women's rights and the education of slaves. Barton W. Stone was a preacher that was expelled from the Presbyterian Church because he believed that faith was only salvation. Overall, the Second Great Awakening helped create greater public roles for white women and much higher African American participation in Christianity than before. And now we got a poster that Talia is going to explain.
So slave rebellion and John Brown's raid and the women's rights movement, which is Center for Falls Conference and the Declaration of Sentiment Rights. And then down here,
The Second Great Awakening, it just gives like different bullet points. And finally, the sign, this is a part of the women's suffrage. This is like a real popular picture when people think women's suffrage. It says, "No self-respecting woman should wish or work for the success of a party that ignores her sex. Susan B. Anthony." And that's all.
Okay, so guys, look at
Industrial Revolution.
So, the industrialization is the start of a new life. Industrialization meant more people in the factories and fewer people on the farms. More wages meant more disposable income and better standard of living meant more people seeking help.
you can use arrows.
Okay. Intro to the Industrial Revolution. It began in the 18th century when agricultural societies became more modern and urbanized. The Transcontinental Railroad, contingent electricity, and many more inventions changed the future of society. That's like a picture of factories.
And so textile mills, so in the early industrial development, textiles were a large part of the industry at that time. So many stores were selling fabrics and different textiles as it was a large and growing industry. So Samuel Slater invented the Rhode Island system. He was the first to use the steam-driven power looms. He relied on sole proprietorship, and he was form of ownership initially relied on family for labor, but as his expansion grew, he started to hire professional managers. That's him.
Francis Lowell. He used water power looms and hired non-family supervisors and managers. And then he also relied on adult female labor in factories. And that's a picture of him.
So child labor, children work long hours in dangerous conditions. At this time, many children work in factories, drop out of school to focus on earning wages. Factory owners like to hold children because they were easy to manage and they could be paid less than adults. So in the 19th century, labor's reform worked to restrict child labor and improve working conditions. So when children worked in factories and mines, there was a high risk of danger. Many children workers lost limbs, or lung disease, conditions they were caught through they were working.
So the role of women. So in the 19th centuries, women entered the workforce to support their families. And they were working in factories for 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, in dangerous conditions with low pay. Early feminist movements to protest against unfair wages and move more equality because became widespread during this time. In the Industrial Revolution, women protesters focused on gaining the right to vote along with equal wages. So that shows pictures. And then two major women's rights activists was Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Pictures.
So labor unions at first, working conditions in factories were horrible, and mines and mills were also terrible. And the government had little interest in creating and enforcing labor regulations. Workers got tired of these terrible working conditions and started to revolt. So these conditions created unions for fighting for safer conditions, increased wages, and better hours. So the unions organized strikes and tried to negotiate with employees for better wages. So one of the major strikes was the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. It started after the B&O Railroad Company cut wages for the third time in 1 year. So other strikes around this time include the Homestead Steel Mill Strike of 1892 and the Pullman Strike of 1894. So these strikes ended in violence and property destruction, but led to the way of workplace improvements.
The American system of manufacturers. So, interchangeable parts previously confined to making muskets and revolvers. The Springfield Armory was an early factory prototype. 250 employees and it was the largest factory in the U.S. until the Civil War. With this, labor became more specialized, and uniform standards promoted interchangeable of parts. Inventive and innovative impulses. Railroads made travel pleasurable and possible, fostering a real-time revolution. The telegraph and the telephone aided the growth of commerce and transportation through communication. Other innovations included electricity, mass marketing, sewing machines, harvesters, and steel. So that's a picture of the steam engine, and that's a picture of the telegraph.
So the railroads pioneered the U.S. management. So it was the first big business in the U.S. and developed around 1830. So it started the transportation revolution, and it changed society from local markets to national markets. And railroads needed more immigrants, and so they needed more labor. So immigrant labor started to flourish, and Irish in the east and Chinese people in the west.
So some inventors. Andrew Carnegie, who was born in 1835 and died in 1919. He used the Bessemer furnace technology to begin vertically and horizontally integrating his firm into the steel industry. Some highlights: the Bessemer process,
You get to do. Sorry.
a technique used to make iron stronger. They replaced the open hearth process, which allowed production of steel. Railroads became the biggest consumers of steel. And that's some pictures of inventors and what they did.
Yeah, that's it.
Some of that was a preview.
And so we wrote a poem. I'm going to read the poem, and Krishna is going to do the questions. Okay. Strong, independent women were seen as second-class citizens, encouraged to stay home and enforce discipline. They were told their life is to take care of their family. Subjected to only childbearing and cleaning is such an agony. They didn't have a name. They were just their husband's possessions. The mistreatment of women was causing great oppression. The Second Great Awakening started challenging a women's traditional role. This influenced the movement of women's rights as a whole, a fight based on the doctrines of progress and faith in social reform. While this awakening gained some respect for women, motherhood was still a social norm. The idea of Republican motherhood gained popularity, a woman being educated in order to raise a smart son and influence family prosperity. Female Reform Society in New York, 1833. Linda Finney was deemed president of the society aimed for public standards and ideals, but started to focus specifically on prostitution and sexual sin. They demanded sexual abstinence from men and rejected the increased sexual freedom among men. They provided female prostitutes with a home and supported women wherever they roam. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott started the movement in which women sought. The Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, the first place where women could change their case. This meeting underlined all of women's suffrage at hand. They fought for human equality with privileges such as buying land. The meeting was held in Seneca Falls, New York, and the first women's rights movement in all of the New World. This convention created the Declaration of Sentiments and Grievances. It covered the injustices that had been afflicted upon women. It begins by stating that all men and women deserve natural rights. American women should be entitled as equal class citizens. It writes, It had given examples illustrating women's oppression, all in the efforts of eliminating female suppression. It was followed by 12 resolutions related to supporting women, but one was rejected because it was controversial and could affect their equality mission.
What is Republican motherhood?
Republican motherhood is basically the idea of women raising men to be great Republicans. Basically, women raising children for the purpose, for the betterment of America, specifically men.
What did the female reform society demanded for men?
Sexual abstinence and I forgot.
It was sexual abstinence,
Yeah,
like that's what they
sexual
demanded. And then they rejected the sexual freedom that men had like over women.
I cannot speak today.
Do you want me to read it?
Yeah.
What did the Declaration of Sentiments and Grievances address?
It addressed basically the grievances that women had concerning their treatment in America, and basically aired their grievances, and then basically explained like demands for what they wanted for the future and what they deserved.
Tanaya, you are on point. You know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah,
that's all.
Alright, so we did the history of the Mormons. So who are the Mormons? The Mormons are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. There are in over 150 countries across the world. However, the religion started in New York in the 1800s. It was founded by Joseph Smith, who's the picture of the frame on the outside, and it was during the Second Great Awakening. Members believe that they belong to restore the church created by Jesus Christ. So they were persecuted for many reasons. One of them was polygamy, or the multiple spouses for each person in the religion. So the families were huge, as seen in the picture. They tried to stop slavery, so they didn't have any slaves. They were a different religion, so they were just bound to get persecuted. And a lot of people were greedy at the time and wanted political power, so they were persecuted because of their power in the communities. And that's a picture of Mitt Romney, because he's a Mormon today and also a political figure. An effect was they migrated from New York to Ohio to Illinois, and then they eventually trekked west to the Salt Lake Valley. So why are they important in APUSH? They're one of the fastest growing religions, and in 1845 there were 40,000 members, and by 1870 there were 120,000 members. In 2017 there's 15.8 million of them. Half of these members reside in America. The Mormons also migrated to Utah, which became the 45th state in the United States of America in 1896. Brigham Young. Brigham Young was Joseph Smith's successor. As a prophet and leader of the Mormon Church, he led the members west of the Rocky Mountains and served as a governor of the territory. Also, he led the efforts in expanding the telegraph and the railroad lines, and founded BYU and the University of Deseret, also known as the University of Utah.
Alright, so we're going to go to some key events of Mormonism. So, first vision, in the spring of 1820, Joseph Smith prays at a grove of trees and is visited by God and Jesus Christ. And then he's instructed to rebuild the church that Jesus founded when he was alive. We're going to go to the Book of Mormon first, how it was founded. So, after being visited by the Angel Moroni, I think, Joseph Smith is led to golden disc that is hidden in New York. Joseph Smith then transcribes the disc into the Book of Mormon, and it gets published in June 1829. The church is officially organized in Fayette, New York, and Joseph Smith, he follows like the standards basically for creating new churches that are held in New York. Another key event is that Ohio gatherings, missionaries start spreading the word of the church and converts a lot of people into the new faith, and eventually, due to persecutions, Mormons would move to Illinois. But on June 27th, my boy Joseph Smith is shot under false pretense. Well, he's jailed first under false charges, and then he is shot by an angry mob. Also, his brother gets shot too. That kind of sucks.
Okay.
So migration to Utah. Eventually, due to even more persecution and revelations from God, Brigham Young leads the Mormons to Rocky Mountains and eventually settles in Salt Lake Valley on July 24th, 1847.
That's our presentation.
Yeah,
Oh no, they mentioned polygamy.
Yeah. World communalism is between the 1820s and 1860s. Thousands of Americans grew dissatisfied with life in America's emerging market society and retreated into rural areas. They desired to create ideal communities or utopias, like small, living conditions that would allow them to live differently and realize their spiritual potential. Utopian impulse. From 1837 to 1843, there was an economic depression, which many rural communalists that were mostly farmers and artisans were seeking refuge from, so they decided to create utopias. One of the first successful American communal movement was the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appear. This church, which the Shakers worshiped this church, and they did ecstatic dances that were a part of their worship. In 1770, Anne Lee Stanley, or also known as Mother Ann, had a vision that she was an incarnation of Christ, and then 4 years later, she led a few followers to America and established a church near Albany, New York. Albert Brisbane Imperialism. Charles Fourier was a French reformer who devised an 8-stage theory of social evolution and predicted the imminent decline of individual property rights and capitalist values. His leading disciple in America was Albert Brisbane, which that's it.
Okay.
John Humphrey Noyes and Oneida. John Humphrey Noyes was a charismatic and religious. He put down the fearless failure to their secular outlook and embraced the pious Shakers as the true pioneer of modern socialism. The Shakers' marriageless society inspired Noyes to create a community that defines sexuality and gender roles in extreme new ways. And then minstrelsy. This was trying to be entertained, them trying to find entertainment, like blood sports, terrier fights, or back smashes. Drinks in clubs and bowling saloons, and performances were put on at theaters. And then immigrant masses and nativist reaction. By 1850, immigrants were a major presence throughout the Northeast. Irish men and women overtook New York, and Germans also. Native-born New Yorkers took alarm as hordes of ethnically diverse migrants altered the city's culture. And that's it.
We did our poem on the Era of Good Feelings. The Era of Good Feelings, lasting from 1815 to 1825, a time of no more greetings, when American unity was most alive. Happiness with no ceilings, America was in full drive. Victorious in the War of 1812, Americans had a sense of national pride. They were very unified selves. Their new purpose and pride were apart. A sensation of nationalism in themselves, ready to enjoy the nation's future.
Great unity under the Democratic Republican Party came with the Federalist Party, but there were few ironies when the Republican Party was split up to minorities. Clay and Adams led the national faction, while Van Buren and Jackson led the Jeffersonian faction in action. Under the leadership of Monroe, America would grow. Monroe had a great passion for Western expansion, passing tariffs and expanding national banking, preventing the economy from tanking.
The Second National Bank was enabled to keep the country's economy stable. Protective tariffs and also showed great efficiency to protect American manufacturing and encourage national economic self-sufficiency. Various internal improvements proved a great creation to improve transportation and connectivity.
No deduction.
They talked about the Mexican-American War, which actually officially ended in on February 2nd of 1848 with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. I probably butchered that.
That's right. You got it.
But this was the treaty that added a lot of the land for present-day Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. So, in this one, he refers to manifest destiny, which was the ideal that as Western settlers, we were destined to continue westward expansion through all of North America. And then the next lines refer to southern states wishing for the newly entered states to be, or under the 3630 line, to be slave states. And the North, of course, wanted them to be free states. But then Henry Clay made his new proposal, which actually didn't get accepted until after he died, or well, was no longer in Congress. But he began pushing for the Great Compromise, which is the Compromise of 1850. Calhoun was a Southern congressional representative, and he was pushing for the newly acquired territory to be slave states, and Webster was a Northern congressman who was pushing for them to be free states. California was introduced as a free state, but as part of this compromise, slave trade was banned in Washington, D.C., although the holding of slaves was legal. And the newly added territories in the U.S. were introduced under popular sovereignty, which was basically the citizens of the states get to vote whether they are slave or free states. The Fugitive Slave Act of
Okay, so a fugitive slave law, and then worse one than before, and it refers back to Dred Scott and Kansas, Nebraska. They're having massacres. So it's just talking about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And this basically required the U.S. government to assist slave owners in capturing their fugitive slaves. So if their slaves ran away to the north, they were allowed to take them back into slavery. And when it's referring back to Dred Scott, he was a slave who went to trial to sue for his freedom. But in the trial, the court decided that all people of African American ancestry, including slaves, they could never become U.S. citizens. Therefore, he could not sue in federal court. And then the Kansas-Nebraska Act was to see Nebraska made into a territory to win support of the South, and this was one of the single most influential events leading up to the Civil War. Territories bleeding, Sumner took a beating, South may be seceding if we mess with their so-called states' rights. So this is talking about, Charles Sumner. He attacked the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, and he wanted to have it repealed, but in 1856, a guy named Preston Brooks attacked Sumner and severely beat him in response to his speech attacking the institution of slavery. And the southern states were really angry that President Lincoln was trying to take away their right of slavery because they thought that that was like a right that they had to own the African Americans. And then the southern states, so they wanted to keep slavery. They thought it was their right. They did not want slavery to go away at all, and the North was fighting for the freedom of slaves, and so the goal of the compromise was to preserve the Union and to settle the issues between the free states and slaves, which it stopped the South from seceding for a while, but it didn't actually stop it completely. And so then it says it caused the southern states to secede. So when the compromise only held off this secession for a little while, it eventually happened because the South did not want slavery to stop spreading or to end. And it's talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was a really famous anti-slavery novel, and it was very widely popular and increased opposition of slavery in the North. And then it's talking about a speech in Illinois. So Lincoln gave a speech in Illinois, and it was noting the conflict between the North and the South, and he was saying that it was intensifying and that they could not permanently have disagreement between half slave and half free. It had to be one or the other. And so this is from the speech, and Lincoln basically said that if the U.S. wanted to be a free country, they have to act now and can't stay divided, which eventually led to a civil war. But yeah, he was basically saying again, like, it can't be divided, so they have to choose one or the other. And then the song just like repeated. But that's it.
But the reason for the Great Compromise primarily was that California, actually the 36-30 line kind of intersected through it, so they really didn't know how to make it or what to make it because it went through both.
All right, good job, guys.
Poster.
Oh, cool. All right.
So Market Revolution, time period. All right. So as American factories and farmers churned out more goods, legislators and businessmen, they created faster and cheaper ways to get products to their consumers. So, around 1820, they began constructing a massive system of canals and roads, linking states along the Atlantic coast with new states in the Trans-Appalachians. So, transportation systems set in a motion of massive migration of people, drained by 6 river systems, which include the Missouri, Arkansas, Red Ohio, Tennessee, and the Mississippi. They contain the largest and most productive contiguous acreage of arable land in the world. And as a result, by 1860, nearly a third of the nation's citizens lived in 8 of its states, which include Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. There they created a rich agricultural economy and an industrializing society similar to that of the Northeast. So overall, the market revolution was the expansion of the marketplace in the early 19th century. It was prompted mainly by the construction of new roads and canals to connect the distant communities for the first time. It also refers to a new approach adopted by farmers to produce for the market rather than individuals. Overall, spurring economic growth. And that's my question.
So description is, it was a period starting in the 1790s and lasted throughout the 1830s. Great Awakening means a passionate and intense religious feeling. The Second Great Awakening was really not like the first one, and the second one had a lot of people that were converted to different denominations of Christianity. So the Second Great Awakening changed how many people looked at religion in the United States. Evangelism became popular during this time. Evangelists were less interested in keeping up religious hierarchies in a tradition compared to other denominations of Christianity, and they had a more populist take on religion and elevated the experiences of a common man. So the effects, Methodists and Baptists were a product of the Second Great Awakening. Methodists and Baptists thought that humans could have a free will and could choose to be saved. One of the consequences of this type of thinking is that there was a new role for women and African Americans. There's more emphasis on the role that an individual will play to change his or her situation, and more enslaved people could find a place in more evangelical denominations. So important figures were Charles G. Finney. He was a well-known minister at this time, and he opposed the traditions of Presbyterianism. And that was the theology, and like the theology typically emphasizes that the sovereignty of God, the authority of the scriptures, and the necessity of grace throughout the faith in Christ. And activism that he did, he was socially progressive and supported abolitionism and women's rights, and he wanted African Americans to be educated. His activism and theology was not accepted by some people that had a more traditional interpretation of the Bible, and that's what he looked like. And Barton W. Stone, he was an important preacher during the Second Great Awakening. He was expelled from the Presbyterian Church after the revival for his beliefs in faith as the only way for salvation, and he allied with Alexander Campbell and formed the Restoration Movement. That's what it looked like.
What are Southern Rights by moi. So the South was, this is basically a story of the haves and have-nots. The South was mainly dominated by wealthy planters, families at the very top of the society. The families had more than 100 slaves and had fertile lands, like a lot of
really good fertile lands for their plantations. The westward movement split elite into two, families that grew from tobacco and rice, and the others were from cotton. Southern gentry, they dominated the tidewater region of the Chesapeake and in the low country south. Built impressive mansions. That's one from present day that was built. Back when. Adopted manners and values of English landed gentry. So they got some of their things from English. More planters and elites. In the 1860s, a minority of 395,000 Southern families owned slaves. Top 1/5 of the families owned 20 or more slaves. 5% of the South white population dominated the economy, owning more than 50% of the slave population. More planter elites part 2. They are responsible for growing 50% of the South's cotton crop. Average wealth of planter families was around 56,000, and back when it would be around, today it would be around 1.6 million. A prosperous southern yeoman or southern farmer owned property only worth around 3,200, so that puts things to scale. Alright. Substantial proprietors own almost 40% of the enslaved laborers. They also produce more than 30% of the cotton. Often they pursue dual careers as artisans or professional men. So, yeah, it's just not just for planting the stuff like for cash crop. So little guys, small holding slave owners held around 1 to 5 slaves and owned a few hundred acres of land. Some were well-connected men who inherited their father's property. Some were poor but were encouraged by the great elite that we talked about before. So who exactly had slaves? Even though the South was a slave society, around 36% of white families had slaves in the 1830s and shrinking basically. 31% in 1850 and 25% a decade later. So this is a graph of the structure of the South in the 1860s and who had slaves around that time. So the majority of them actually don't have slaves, if you can't tell from that big 1/4 section. So the poor freemen. So the people who didn't actually have slaves, many of them were poor, rights without property, suffered in a slave society. They had little respect. Slave owners didn't pay taxes, so public schools were not funded. So wealthy planters bid up the price of slaves, preventing white laborers from slave labor needed for wealth. All white men were forced to serve as patrols and militias to stop slave uprisings. So many of the people on the top actually had a lot of political power, which made them able to force a lot of people who didn't have slaves to protect them, basically.
There was a law where you had to carry your gun to church.
Yes, I'm sure it wasn't really very safe, considering there was probably some slave uprisings at the time. Poor freemen. So this guy Frederick Law Olmsted said the majority of white Southerners are poor. They had very little of the common comforts and consolations of civilized life. This destitution is not material only; it is intellectual and it is moral. So, as goes to show, many of the missing things that people who didn't have slaves actually were dealing with.
He did the layout for Biltmore Estate and Central Park, so he was not only a reporter for New York Times, he was also a landscape architect. He's a pretty smart guy.
Poor freemen, part 3. Despite being poor, whites, many of them enjoy the idea of being superior to blacks. James Henry Hammond, the planter, told his white neighbors, in a slave country, any free man is an aristocrat. Many Southern whites rejected this idea and sought farms in Appalachian Hill country and beyond. And this is that dude that made that quote, and this is some of the ideas that were being projected through the South, that whites were inferior to blacks.
Almost identical to a Nazi textbook in the 30s. Almost identical images, yeah.
And that is it.
Elias, that was much better than the first.
Considering many Southerns were outraged by the efforts of abolitionists. The anti-slavery society would launch the movement in 1935, known as the Great Postal Campaign. The purpose of this movement was to flood the South with anti-slavery and awareness about the cruelty of slavery. But many mobs of the Southerners would become more and more frustrated with the abolitionists until finally they started to vandalize and destroy abolitionists' attempts for the Great Postal Campaign. At this point in the South, abolitionists were seen as villains.
Alright, so from the abolitionist video, it went over William Lloyd Garrison. He was one of the main abolitionists for the anti-slavery society. And William Lloyd Garrison was one of the main voices of abolitionism who would fight for the freedom of slaves for over 25 years. So he's been doing that for a while. He published a newspaper weekly called The Liberator in Boston, which appealed to the moral conscience of the reader trying to convince the society to end slavery. William Lloyd Garrison was also one of the founders of the American Anti-Slavery Society, stated before. And he believed that the U.S. Constitution was rather a pro-slavery document, rather than a document to prohibit slavery. And Frederick Douglass believed that the U.S. Constitution had enough power to end slavery. This would create further tension between these two for, I'd say, around 10 years, I believe. And then...
and the next person was Frederick Douglass. He was also talked about, and he was an escaped slave from Maryland, and he wrote about the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, in 1945. This book talked about all of his personal experiences, and it was a slave book that raised awareness about the cruelty and abuse that he went through and slaves went through. And Frederick would also speak in front of thousands about slavery and abolitionist movements.
Alright, so another abolitionist we're going to talk about is Angelina Grimke. And she was not only an abolitionist, but also a women's rights advocate. And she also had a sister named Sarah Grimke, and they would fight with the abolitionist movement to end slavery. And they were actually born in South Carolina, and apparently they were the only abolitionists from the South to try to prohibit slavery. And they would always try to convince their family that slavery is wrong, but they never listened to them. So next we're going to talk about Theodore Weld, which is this guy up here. And he actually married Angelina Grimke. And Theodore Weld is important because he would organize movements for the AASS, or the American Anti-Slavery Society. And he would also be a speaker and a writer.
This book would sell thousands and thousands of copies, so it spread very well towards the nation and gave insight on how cruel slavery was. And this would start the momentum to start the American Anti-Slavery Society.
Alright. And then one of Harriet Still's brothers, Henry Ward Beecher, and that's this guy right here, was an abolitionist and social reformer who would speak about slavery and the abolitionist movement. He was also known for his emphasis on God's love. And then lastly, we have this guy right here. This is John Brown, and armed more slaves. Ultimately, though, he would fail and would be captured and he would be hanged.
Are we good?
Are you good?
Turn the lights off.
Yeah.
Polygamy and the increase of moral
Did you eat? Never mind. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Sorry. That's on me. That's on me. I'm sorry.
What was it? It's like...
There's a name for that. There is a name.
There is a name?
For what Joseph Smith started?
Oh,
You
yeah,
know,
I was
Smith. We've got like 2 or 3 lessons on Joseph Smith this morning. See?
Oh, that's right. That's the Mormons. Yes.
Oh my God. Good friend.
I thought that was a whole different... Oh, because... Yeah.
So the questions are, name 2 reasons why women were oppressed, like harsh treated.
Well, I guess it's not harsh, but like they were told that they had to stay home and be like that,
I said like 2 reasons. You had to name reasons, like the way they were
That's a
harsh.
reason.
Yeah.
They had to stay home and stuff, and like they were like seen as like only taking care of like
The
the children and the house and stuff, and they had like no other like moral obligations.
I'm sorry.
Krista,
I'm sorry.
what? He was coming in with reason. Don't be stupid.
No, Andrew, no.
And the thing is her sentence started the same as your sentence.
Dividing North and South once more.
Good morning, students and staff. Thank you so much for your engagement this morning in our session. At this time, all students from those sessions should be back in classes. We are finished with the session for
I'll edit
and
it.
thank you for your engagement.
I'll edit it.
And let's have a great day. Thank you.
I'll cut out you said, oh blank, there's a video. Alright.